Alright, hi guys. I'm back today with another video. And this video is going to be a book review on a book I recently read called I'm the Man by Scottian. Now, I've been a big Anthrax fan for a long time. I still am a big fan. And I wanted to read this book because I've been a really big fan of a lot of these rock books that have been coming out, in the past few years. A lot of books have come out. Gene Simmons has put out a book. Paul Stanley put out a book. Peter Criss has put out a book. Glenn Hughes put out a book. Sammy Hagar, Joe Perry. So, yeah, just a lot of people have been putting out books. Tony Iommi has one. And I've been a big fan of these books. I've been reading a lot of them. And I want to do a book review on this one in particular, which, like I said, is I'm the Man by Scottian. Now, like I said, I've been a big Anthrax fan for many years. Anthrax was actually the first band that I saw in concert. I saw them in concert back at the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago back in 1993 with White Zombie as the opening band. White Zombie had just become popular at that time. But, so want to do this book review, talk a little bit about the band, about the band Anthrax, and about the book. Now, Scottian, as Anthrax fans, of course, know, is from New York. He grew up with his mom and dad. He speaks kind of favorably about his dad, that he had a good relationship with his dad. He talks of his dad being a very level-headed guy, and and how his dad really understood Scott's music pursuits. But he said he had more of a difficult time dealing with his mom. He doesn't seem to have a very favorable opinion of his mom. He says mom was kind of overly emotional about a lot of things, and he mentions that the marriage of his mom and dad ended in 1975, when Scottian was, I think, 10 or 11. And, he gets into that. He talks about how his mom, I believe it was his mom, had like a pretty extensive music collection, and he would get into bands, and then later he got a guitar. Now, Scottian mentions this, and this is probably no surprise to Anthrax fans or people who know about the band, but Scottian even says in the book that he was never the kind of guy who would practice leads for hours on end in his bedroom. He wasn't that kind of like Scott Weiland type guitar player. But he does mention, wanting to try to get the band off the ground and working hard to promote the band. He mentioned that he formed the band in 1981 with a good friend of his, a guy by the name of Dan Lilliker. And Scottian and Dan Lilliker always used to talk about, how they wanted to make it huge in the band, how they wanted to tour the world, just the kind of things that, guys who are in bands would talk about, right? Touring the world, making it huge, recording albums, just all those things. And that's what they would talk about. Now, Anthrax was then in need of a singer, so the singer that they got, first, and I didn't know this, and Scottian does mention this, but Scottian actually gave the singer of the band Riot a call, because he had just left the band Riot. It was a guy by the name of, I want to say his name was Guy Sparza, but he had just left the band Riot, and Scottian gave him a call and asked him if he wanted to join Anthrax. And the former singer of Riot said, "No, I'm out of the music business. I'm working as an exterminator now, and I'm just more happy doing that." So it's kind of interesting because I am a big Riot fan, and I did not know that. I did not know that, the former singer of Riot, the first singer of Riot, almost joined Anthrax. Completely unknown to me. But after that, Scottian then got Neil Turbin in the band, and things were kind of rocky when they had Neil Turbin in the band. Neil Turbin, I guess, didn't like Dan Lilliker, and Dan Lilliker was a great bass player. In fact, I believe Scott Ian even says that his nickname was Beethoven because he was regarded as being a great musician. But Neil Turbin, for whatever reason, didn't like Dan Lilliker, and he wanted Scott Ian to fire Dan Lilliker, and Scott Ian did. And Scott Ian said he really regretted that because, it was a friend of his that, they would always talk for hours on end about the band and traveling and all that kind of stuff, and he ended up kicking him out of the band, and Scott Ian really regretted that. And then relations between Scott Ian and Neil Turbin grew worse. And, eventually, Scott Ian ended up getting rid of Neil Turbin. He kind of didn't like the direction that Neil Turbin wanted to take the band in. Also, Scott Ian wanted to focus on more of that, like thrash kind of sound. And Neil Turbin, Scott Ian mentions this, didn't seem to really get the whole idea of thrash and didn't really want to do that kind of thing. So, that's mentioned in the book. Because, thrash at that point was, something that was new. And, Anthrax become one of the major, players in that metal genre. So, after this, Anthrax got another singer, and the singer that they got in the band next was Joey Belladonna. And Joey Belladonna was from New York, but not from New York City. He was actually from upstate New York, and he was playing in a band at that time with the cousin of Dio called Bible Black. They were playing in this band together, and, he then auditioned for Anthrax. He got it. He joined Anthrax. The drummer at the time was Charlie Benante. Charlie Benante was, Scott Ian mentions this, a great drummer. Scott Ian knew he was a great drummer. I think, Charlie Benante had been playing since he was very young. So he had already, by the time he was in his 20s, he had been playing for many years. Now, the next bass player they got was Charlie Benante's nephew, Frank Bello. Frank Bello had been a roadie for the band, and then he joined Anthrax as their new bass player. Now, Anthrax also had Dan Spitz in the band. Scott Ian had met Dan Spitz. I think it was at like a music store. And throughout this book, Scott Ian generally does not have a very favorable opinion of Dan Spitz. Doesn't say a whole lot of really bad things, but doesn't really say that they really hit it off that well. And then, eventually, they ended up getting rid of Dan Spitz altogether. But then he came back for the reunion tour. And all that, of course, is mentioned in this. And, Scott Ian talks about, recording the albums and what that was like. He talks about the Among the Living tour with Metallica and certain things that I didn't know. I guess on that tour, James Hetfield, Cliff Burton, and Kirk Hammett were talking with Scott Ian, and they told them that as soon as we get home, as soon as we get back to the Bay Area, we're kicking Lars out of this band. That's what they were saying. I didn't know that either. They wanted to kick Lars out. But then when they were in Sweden, the tragedy happened where, unfortunately, Cliff Burton was killed. And as a result of that, Scott Ian then asked James, are you still going to get rid of Lars when you get home? And he said, no, we can't. We can't lose another band member at this point. If we lose another band member at this point, Metallica's finished. So they didn't end up kicking Lars out of the band. And, I guess Lars knows this. This is no secret. He knows that what they were planning. But, I was unaware of that. I never knew that. But Scott Ian then talks about other Anthrax albums. He talks about State of Euphoria and the recording of the State of Euphoria album. Now, other than Be All End All and the Trust cover of Antisocial, I was never really a big fan of this album. In fact, I always thought that the album seemed like it was kind of unfinished. And Scott Ian even says, in the book that it was unfinished because they got an offer to go out to open for Iron Maiden on the Seventh Son tour. So the album was never finished. And, I always kind of assumed that, was unfinished because you listen to it. It doesn't sound like it's completely done. And that's exactly what he says. So that was interesting to hear that from Scott Ian because although Anthrax had some commercial success at that point in time, I always thought that was a pretty weak album. And unfortunately, because they had commercial success at that point, that album has caused people to kind of say that Anthrax is not a very talented band, when certainly not true. But they'll say Anthrax is not talented, and a lot of times they have that album in mind. So, yeah, with that said, they then, got in the studio, continued to make more albums, and at this point, Scott Ian was, talking about Anthrax and the image of Anthrax, and, they mentioned the fact that, Anthrax always had the reputation of kind of being rock's clean-living, fun-loving group of guys, and, that was the reputation that Anthrax had, and I think that was the reason why they were popular in the Midwest. Midwesterners really liked that, and they liked that image, and I think they also kind of liked the kind of modesty Anthrax kind of had, I think it was. But, Anthrax was pretty big with Midwesterners. And Scott Ian talks about that. He talks about the band during the State of Euphoria tour kind of moving in a direction that he kind of wasn't really crazy about. He said they were all wearing shirts of cartoon characters and stuff, and, they had, like, stickers of cartoon characters on their guitars, and Scott Ian said that he felt that Anthrax was kind of becoming a parody of itself. And certainly the band kind of moved in another direction with the Persistence of Time album, and he mentions that. And he mentions then kind of wanting to get rid of Belladonna, which they ultimately did, and he was replaced with John Bush. Now, John Bush is, one of the greatest singers of all time, in my opinion. I put him in the top 5. In the top 5 of greatest singers of all time. He just really knows how to do it. And Scott Ian even says he always thought that he was kind of like a heavier version of like John Fogerty, and I agree with that. He kind of like a heavier version of that style of singing. And it really worked great in metal. And it worked great with Anthrax music, that's for sure. And they put out Sound of White Noise, which is my favorite Anthrax album of all time, The Sound of White Noise. I think that's their best album. And they put that album out, toured around with it. That was when I saw them. I actually met them at a record store before the concert. And, it was cool to, meet Anthrax when I was in high school. It was cool to have that opportunity. They were all great guys, from what I could tell. And, they signed my album cover that I had of Sound of White Noise at the time. And Scott Ian actually mentions the show that I saw them at, because during that show, Al Jorgensen, of Ministry, came up on stage and played a song with Anthrax, and then he kind of hung around the band for a little bit, and Scott Ian mentions that in the book, how he was kind of hanging around the band. And I think because at that time, I think he was dating the bassist from White Zombie. But, so Scott Ian was talking about him a bit, and then there was some story that he talks about, involving Al Jorgensen that was kind of disgusting, so I won't go into that, but yeah, so just a lot of different kinds of stories. Some things are funny, some things aren't. The Scotty Ian, as Anthrax fans would know, he could be pretty funny. He has a funny story in there about his mom and telling his mom that he wanted to be a rock star, and he said, "I think you could still probably hear the shriek that my mom let out floating around in space somewhere." Scotty was funny. His dad, he said, was more supportive of it. He worked at his dad's jewelry store for a while to, support the band and to get the band off the ground. So, yeah, definitely some, interesting stories here. Talks more about, the John Bush years. And I guess him and John Bush really hit it off. They hung around a lot together. And, they did some albums. Ultimately, what ended up happening was John Bush, got kids and got married. And he didn't really want to tour a whole lot. But the way the music business is now, you kind of have to tour. So Anthrax had to get another singer. And they went back to Belladonna. And that's who they have in the band now for the past couple of albums. Belladonna had, rejoined Anthrax, and, they put out a couple albums, just put out an album. I think the last album came out last February, For All Kings, I believe was the name of it. I still haven't picked it up yet. I still have to get it. I usually always get their albums. I've seen it some places, kind of expensive, so want to see maybe I could find it on Amazon, maybe for a cheaper price. But, yeah, so, that's what I have to say on it. Scotty Ian definitely wrote a good book. Not too much of a slam book. He does say some things about, like, Blackie Lawless and how he didn't really care for Blackie Lawless too much, but doesn't really get into too much detail about that. Talks a little bit about his marriages. Scotty Ian has been married a few times. I want to say he's on his third wife, who is, Meatloaf's daughter. And they actually have a project together now called Motor Sister. And I've heard it, and I think it's good. I definitely think it's good. I like that, 70s rock sound that they have. So, it talks about different things. It talks about another project that he had with one of the guys from the band Fall Out Boy. So there's just different, projects that Scotty Ian has been involved in. And that's all I really have to say about it. Just wanted to do this book review, wanted to talk a little bit about it. If you watched this video, as always, I thank you for watching.